I go through a ton of keyboards, and recently I've been putting stock Gateron yellows in most of them to do some standardized testing. Because we care so much about that 5% difference, it's easy to lose track of the fact that most keyboards are pretty much the same. So when I come across one that's different in some aspect, it's a nice change of pace. The Sirius is the first board I've ever seen whose case is made of milled POM. POM is a low friction plastic that's used in a bunch of stuff, including stems and switches. From what I can find on Wikipedia, it seems to be a pretty high performance material, and maybe it's better suited for keyboards than something like polycarbonate. The Sirius has a bit of an imposing design. It's got a healthy bezel at just under a centimeter on all four sides, and the corners are pretty well rounded. The sides of the keyboard are angled inward such that the base is wider than the top. This gives the board a bit of a stance, much like the KBD 661, but less aggressive. The case takes a standard 60% PCB, so the USB port is on the left side. Because of the thickness of the rear, the cutout is quite a bit recessed and is not all that tight. The most interesting thing about the side profile is that rear, which comes to a point. When combined with the uninterrupted front wall, this rear overhang contributes to the theme of substance on the board. It also has the added benefit of making it easier to pick up. This may make it taller than usual, but in reality, the typing height is not much higher than typical. Definitely more than the QXP, but almost anything is. The bottom doesn't really have anything going on except the internal weight cutout casting a shadow on the thinnest parts. When assembled, it actually looks about the same whether you have the weight in or not. I don't really like this because it almost looks like a defect, but it might just be a material limitation. To mitigate this, I suppose they could change the shape of the internal weight to be just a rectangle so it looks more purposeful. The design on the Sirius is consistent and inoffensive. It being made specifically for this material probably meant some different requirements when compared to something like aluminum. I would guess that one of these were thicker bezels, and the Sirius succeeds by incorporating that with the overarching theme of posture without completely going off the rails like the KBD 661. Getting into the board is straightforward. Just undo these 6 nicely shiny machine screws in the back and unjoin the top and bottom halves. Because the bottom half contains a little piece around the USB port, you won't be able to just lift it up, but rather angle the top out by lifting the front first. You'll see here that the board is top mount with a standard 8 mounting points, none of which are directly under the spacebar. Pretty typical stuff there. With the keyboard assembly removed, you can also see that the top half is symmetrical. Obviously, due to the USB port, you won't be able to do negative angle or anything, but I guess this would save me 2 seconds every time I reassemble. I really super appreciate these 6 guides that help fit the top and bottom pieces tightly. They're actually so tight that you don't need screws to hold them together. Not very securely, but nevertheless. Some more expensive boards can learn from this, particularly if they're made of plastic. I have an issue with my polycarbonate E6.5 where the top and bottom halves sort of meet freely. With that said, when completely assembled, a noticeable seam presents itself in the front and the rear. The left and right are pretty much flush, but I guess the longer sides have a little more room for error. On the inside of the bottom is the pretty complex cutout for the internal weight. I think it was said that the weight is more for rigidity than for adding mass, so the intention might have been to have a tight interconnect between the bottom and the weight, such that the bottom conforms to the straightness of the brass. When installed, it's really difficult to remove from its slot. I usually have to tap it on the table pretty hard for it to come out.
Agreed? Yes. Good night.
The weight itself is polished PVD brass. Under very close inspection, you can see some hairline scratches on it, but it's not a big deal since it's internal. In the newer in-stock version of the Sirius, this has been changed to sandblasted brass, which I think makes a lot of sense. Other than the ones for the internal weight, all of the screw holes in the Sirius use these brass inserts. I appreciate them since it's always a bit concerning to reassemble plastic boards with material threads since it's much easier to strip than in metal. One concern I have is that the inserts for the plate have one side that's really thin. One of the 8 on mine has a little stress line. A keyboard is usually not under so much pressure, but I would be slightly worried about these falling out. Machined POM plastic cases aren't really something we've seen before, and it's a little more rigid than polycarbonate. I can bend the thinner top piece a bit, but it takes a little more effort than my E6.5, and the bottom piece is functionally solid. POM is also about 15% denser than PC according to Google, and the Sirius feels a little more substantial than your average polycarbonate case. Of course, that is in part due to having some thicker design elements, but this feels less like a toy than my E6.5. The overall finish of this board is also pretty solid. There are no machining marks or scrapes on the exterior, and the interior is also nicely sandblasted. The only untreated surface is a portion of the inside of the top case, as well as the internal weight cutout which show machining lines. The texture of this sandblasted POM is pretty interesting. They're slightly rougher than something like keycap surfaces and feels a bit dusty. It doesn't leave any dust on my hands, but it feels like it should. do be advised that this seems to scratch fairly easily. I think the sound on the Sirius is somewhere between an aluminum board and a polycarbonate one in terms of resonance. Aluminum usually has more dampened tone, whereas a PC board has a deeper, more resonant sound. The POM case seems to lie somewhere in the middle. Of course, this is impossible to test conclusively until we have the exact same design made from these three materials, so don't quote me on this. The Sirius by default comes with a POM plate, which is a relatively unusual choice. The feel seems to be also somewhere between aluminum and polycarbonate. Obviously, it leans much heavier towards PC, but I would describe it as feeling tighter. Imagine jumping on one of those tiny trampolines for POM versus a large one for polycarbonate. There's a vibration transfer between the hands on bottom out, but it dissipates quickly. As a top mount should be, it's more consistent than a tray mount board, and other than the somewhat exotic plate material, it feels as expected. Other than the material choice, the Sirius is a pretty regular keyboard, a top mount 60% that takes a standard PCB. While I like the design, it's not something I continuously appreciate like I do with the QXP, and once the novelty wears out, it's mostly just another keyboard that I might use from time to time. The interesting part is when it comes to value. When you want a milled keyboard made of something other than aluminum, you often have to pay a premium, but the kit I have, which includes the case, plate, and internal weight, was relatively affordable at around $275 before shipping. The price has been adjusted for the in-stock release to $325 for the same configuration, citing low yields and increased tariffs. Given shipping to the US and the price for a PCB to make this a complete kit, you're looking at somewhere around $350 for the Sirius. At that price, you're approaching the range for polycarbonate cases at group buy pricing. I paid about $350 for my E6.5, but typically shipping for these is higher than the US-based project keyboards. Even at this new price, it doesn't seem to have any problem selling out, especially because there's just a complete lack of premium in-stock boards made of alternative materials. I would hope to see more options like this in the future from more entry-level outlets like KBD fans, but until then the Sirius will occupy a unique position in the market.